Hi, I'm Ed Charbeneau, Principal Developer Advocate for Progress Software, and today we're going to be talking about Blazor stability testing tools for bulletproof applications. So .NET developers love testing. We love it so much that the XUnit framework has been downloaded over 100 million total downloads, and that's pretty crazy. And if you're looking at building a Blazor application in the near future, then you're probably wondering why I believe that Blazor is inherently testable. So for me, Blazor is a full stack C# framework that we can use to build components that are based off of .NET classes. So these things, to me, identify Blazor as a very inherently testable thing. So C# and being able to use the same language across the back end and the front end means that we can use the same test frameworks on the back and front end. We can also test these components because they are C# code and .NET classes. And of course, if you're doing any kind of .NET development, you've probably encountered Visual Studio. And if you've done any testing with it, you know the integration with testing in Visual Studio is fantastic. And I'm talking about testing it all. We can do all sorts of test scenarios with our Blazor applications. We can do unit testing, integration testing, and full system testing with this framework. Now, depending on the tools that you use, you're probably going to use something like XUnit or BUnit to do those front-end unit testing and integration testing. You may use something on the back end or for the system testing like Selenium. If you're a Telerik customer, we've been working really hard on integrating all of these things together. So if you're building UIs with Telerik UI for Blazor, then we have some frameworks to help with that process. And it integrates tightly into some of our other products that have to deal with testing. So for example, XUnit and BUnit work perfect with JustMock. And those things have been built with Telerik UI for Blazor in mind as well. And Telerik UI for Blazor also exposes some translators that help the browser understand the components better. So you get better system integration tests with Telerik Test Studio when you're using Telerik UI for Blazor. So this is something that I've been focused on for the last year, is seeing how I can integrate all of these products together. And now we're delivering those things to our customers. When we talk about unit testing, we often talk about red-green refactor, and I think this is something that's very powerful with the Blazor framework. The fact that we can unit test our components means we can get in this red-green refactor type of mindset. So we're talking about test-driven development. And we talk about red-green refactor, we mean our components or our units under test are going to fail, and then we're going to write the proper code until they pass. And then we can refactor those things safely and quickly without worrying that they're going to break when they're in production. So we can refactor with confidence. So for writing unit tests in .NET, you're probably familiar with something like XUnit. And with XUnit and Blazor and the .NET stack, we can test with XUnit across the entire application. This includes shared libraries, component logic, application logic, and so on. A typical XUnit test that we might use for some shared logic might test something like validation. Since validation can be used on the front end for UI validation, such as an email form input, and then on the back end to make sure that emails are valid before we submit those to the database. We can use XUnit to test this kind of shared logic across our entire project. This is an example of what one of those unit tests would look like. And if we break it down, the first thing we do is give an attribute, a fact attribute, that just identifies that this is a test within our code, and it lets us signify a clear display name. So one thing that's nice about this is we can name our tests appropriately using spaces and everything and get that nice feedback inside of our IDE. When something goes wrong, we know more about the test and what we can do to fix it. If we go down a little bit, we'll arrange our tests. So we have an example of our valid email, what we expect to be a valid input. We have our unit under test, which is our new email validator, and then we'll do some sort of action upon that object. So in this case, we're going to run the validate method, passing in the known valid email, and check to see if it is indeed working. Then we can assert to see if that logic is working by calling assert.true. True is the expected response we'd want to get from a valid email. This is how an XUnit test works, and this is very similar to how component tests work within the Blazor framework. So in addition to XUnit, we'll be using something called bunit, and this is a test library for the Blazor framework written by Eagle Hansen, another Microsoft MVP. So when we're testing a component with bunit for the Blazor framework, it's going to look a lot like our normal unit tests. And this is because we can leverage our favorite unit test libraries like XUnit and use bunit alongside that test library. So for this example, we're using XUnit again. So we have our fact attribute at the top and a proper name for the test. The next thing we'll do is render our component. And this is going to tell bunit to actually render the component just as it would within our application. We're going to set up our expectations for what this component should render as. So in the test, we define the markup that we expect the alert component to render as on its first render. So here we have a div with some classes that should be applied and a close button that should be in the alert to dismiss the alert box. And then at the bottom of the test, once again, we'll just assert that this is, in fact, what we got from the rendered markup. So we'll say component under test markup matches the expected markup. And if the markup is correct and our component logic is good, this test will pass. So let's take a quick tour of a project using these unit tests, and we'll actually test a component with the bunit library and see what we can do. So let's jump over to Visual Studio, where I have that same unit test that we just saw in the slides. And this is going to make sure that our initial alert box renders the correct markup. In our Test Explorer, you can see we have some failing tests. So let's dive into these. We're going to make these tests we're going to fix these tests and make them work as we go through the session here today. So let's expand this window out so we can see where our unit tests actually are. We have some integration tests here, which some are failing, and we have some unit tests here. Again, some of the alert box tests are failing as well. If we open up our Solution Explorer, just to give a quick tour of the project, you can see we have an application here with all of the application logic. There's a server and client application in this as well. So we have a client, server, and a shared library. And then we have several test libraries as well. We have our end-to-end tests, our integration tests, and our unit tests. We're going to focus on the unit tests first, as we saw the alert tests are failing. So bring up our Test Explorer again. We can actually see the messages off of those failing tests. The first one here is checking to see if the info theme is applied when we pass in a parameter to the alert box to tell it to render in a different color. So we have an alert theme or an info theme color to go in this alert box, and that is not rendering correctly. What's nice about this is we get the expected message compared to the actual, and it's showing us the literal position in which our CSS class is not being applied. So we'll go in and fix that one in just a moment. We've got an alert is dismissible that's failing, and there is an HTML comparison exception here again. So this is looking for the actual markup versus the expected markup. And our expected markup is a button to open the alert box after it's been dismissed to show it again. So our show button is missing, and we're still in the state of showing the alert with the close message. And then our very first test here is supposed to check and see if our alert is rendering its initial markup correctly. And we're missing alert danger at the end of this test. So I can see that my initial div here has a missing class on it. So let's dive into that code and see why our alert is missing this text. So in my client application, we'll navigate over to the alert component, which is in my shared folder. And you can see that I have a div with a class alert, and we're missing the alert danger message from that component. Now I can go back to my unit test and rerun this test and make sure it's rendering that initial markup correctly. So we'll run the test again and the test passes. So what's really nice about this process is we're in that red-green refactor mode, and we're not going back to the browser constantly to check and see if our application is working properly in the browser, because then we have to recompile the application, load it, navigate to certain parts of the application where these components exist, and that gets to be a lengthy process. Even with something like hot reload, this can get kind of convoluted, where we have to keep going to the browser to check our work. This lets us stay inside of our IDE and check the work here. This also makes a repeatable process that we can run in a more automated fashion. So let's check some more of these. I've got an alert info theme that's not being applied. So in this class, I'm supposed to be applying another CSS class here of alert info if someone has set the info property on this component. So in here, we have a string that is applying a CSS alert, and this Boolean value is toggling whether this is alert info or alert danger. Now, when I corrected this code earlier, I made a little mistake, and what I should have done is made this CSS alert here, where this is now a dynamic CSS class that the component can toggle. So we'll save that, and we'll go back to our test explorer and run this again. And just as I expected, that passed. So finally, I have the ability to dismiss this alert box. And when it's dismissed, it will condense down to a button that lets us show the alert if we dismissed it by mistake. And right now, there's an error in the code that for some reason, when somebody clicks on the close button, the open button isn't toggled in the UI. So if I look at my code here, I have an if statement that says, if it is hidden or if it is not hidden, show the alert message with the close button inside. If it is hidden, show the open button. Now, if I go down to my code, I've made this easy for myself so I can do the demos today without having to watch me struggle through these errors. But I've noted here that I have a logical error here. So when my hide method is called, I'm not toggling this is hidden method, or this field is hidden correctly. So this should actually be true. So somebody's made a logical error there and we need to fix it. So I'll go back to my unit test, run it again. And now my alert is dismissible. So I know I'm rendering the correct logic there. And when that button is pressed, it should then toggle that value is hidden to true, and it will display the correct message. So let's go back and look at those unit tests one more time, just to make sure we have a full understanding of what they're doing. So with the initial rendering markup, we're just checking to see if the right markup is on the page when the component is rendered. For the second one, we're making sure that the alert is dismissible, and when I click the close button, that the open button shows. So we're going to render our alert. Our expected markup is our open button. We're going to click on the close button and then check to see if the expected open button is there on the page. Then finally, our alert with the info theme, we're going to render our component and we're going to pass in a parameter setting the info property to true. What we're expecting here is a specific CSS class. So notice this is a little bit different than the previous test where we're checking the entire rendering of the HTML. Since we're already handling that in our initial markup, we don't need to check all of that again. I'm just focused on the CSS that is being applied to the container of this element. So I'm going to say the expected CSS class is going to be the string. We'll find that wrapper element in the DOM, and then we will get the class attribute from it and get the actual CSS that was rendered and compare our expected and our actual CSS. So with those tests, we can reassure that that alert box is working with all of its properties and parameters as we designed it. So that one's complete. That is all of our UI tests, our standalone unit tests for our UI anyway. So let's go back to the presentation for a moment and talk a little bit more about how we can do some integration testing with BUnit. Now, everybody's definition of integration testing is going to vary a little bit. I personally feel like some of these tests where we're testing multiple components in a scenario where they're working together on a page are integration tests. And this is because we have parameters and cascading values and injected services that are all running in context of these components. And when we have these complex scenarios, it's often helpful to have things like fakes and mocks to help us with these external services to make sure that we have consistent inputs and outputs so that we can test these scenarios completely. So with BUnit, we have an IJS runtime that can be mocked, and we can also handle things like authentication and authorization and external data services. With this, we might need some additional mocking tools. So Telerik UI or Telerik has a mocking tool called JustMock, and JustMock is a free and commercial product that can replace objects to simulate real ones. So if we have something that is connecting to a database, for example, we don't want to connect to a live database where the data might be changing and we can't expect a consistent output from that service. So what we can do instead is replace that with a mock service very easily with Telerik JustMock. And this is going to isolate the code so we can focus in on the test and make sure that the test is failing or passing and not some erroneous data coming from the database and causing it to fail. So if we look at how to mock services with JustMock, it's very straightforward. We don't even need an actual object to mock a service. All we need is an interface. So with Telerik JustMock, we'll set up a variable and tell it to mock.create an iData service. This interface can be anything in your application that you rely on for data, for example, or communicating with another part of an application, or authentication, things in your application that may vary from instance to instance. Then we'll call mock.arrange on the methods that we'll be calling in this test. And with mock.arrange, we can tell the mock object how to respond to those methods and properties with known data. So for example, here, we're going to call get regions from our data service. And when that method is called, we want to get back this static string string array of A, B, C, and D. This way, we're not calling out to a data service that has data that's maybe input by users or some other variables that are constantly moving. We have a known array that's going to be returned for us so we can test an integration with other components in the system. So let's take a look at how we can use JustMock and Telerik UI for Blazor and BUnit to do some unit testing. So we have our integration tests now in this test runner, and I'm going to run all the tests again just to make sure that we're still in the same mode that we left it in, and we have one test that is passing successfully. Let's take a look and see what this one is doing. So in this test, we have a test that's making sure that the default birth year is initializing correctly. And you'll notice here we're not testing individual component code this time. Our markup, we're testing the logic behind several components that are working together. So this tests an actual set of inputs that are on a form and making sure that they all integrate properly together. So we have things like date inputs and cascading dropdowns, and we want to make sure that all of those things are synced up correctly. So we're going to initialize the form with the year 1980. So it's a nice mid-range number that people can use to scroll up or down a date picker and choose their birth date from. So we're going to first arrange our unit or our integration test, and we're going to new up a new form. So we're going to create a brand new form, and when that form model is created, we expect the form's birth date, this pre-selected date, to be 1980. And then we'll assert that in that model, the birth date is that year. And that one's passing. So let's take a look at our user form view model real quick and see how that's being done. So we have a brand new, we have a class here with a birth date, and it's newing up a brand new date time and initializing that at the year 1980. So that has all been set up correctly. There are other properties in here that we want to make sure that our tests or our components are using appropriately. So let's take a look at our test explorer again, and you can see that we have some tests around cascading drop-down boxes. We have some exceptions here. It says cannot provide a value for property, data service on type, testable, data service for type on index, which is our component. There's no registered service of type. When you see a message in Blazor that says there is no registered service of type, and then it gives you the type that it expects, this means that dependency injection is not set up correctly. So if we look at our code for this test, there may be a problem. And with BUnit and JustMock, we're able to register services just like we would in our working Blazor application. And we haven't done that correctly here yet. So we need to make sure that we have our services aligned before we can test our components. Otherwise, dependency injection will not work properly. So I have a method here that's been set up, and it hasn't been added to our pipeline yet to set up our tests. So we'll go ahead and enable this. So we're going to add our mock data services. Let's take a look and see what's inside. This is just like the example we saw on the slides. We're going to create an iData service using Telerik JustMock by calling mock.create and passing in the interface that we would like to mock. This will give us back an instance that implements that iData service. Next, we're going to arrange the mock data service to give us 4 regions for our get regions method call. So when we call get regions, we'll have A, B, C, and D. We also have a method called get teams by region. And get teams by region is going to accept any string input. And when it accepts that input, it's going to echo back the value, passing it into the region section here. So we're going to get A, for example, and pass it into get teams by region, and it will return the region of red A. And if we pass in B, we'll get back red B, and so on. This will return red region, green region, and blue region. So we have an expected output now from those methods. With the Bunit library, we'll go ahead and inject those services into the dependency injection container, and we'll add those as a mock data service. And notice I also have add Telerik Blazor here. So our Telerik UI for Blazor components are also being tested under this integration test. And we're able to do that because our service works with the bunit library. So we made sure that the user is initialized on the first year. We have an error that we may have fixed by injecting the correct service. So we'll go ahead and run all of our tests again and see if we get a different message. And we did. So there's still failing, but this time there's a different exception. This one is a not implemented exception. This means that the method was defined by the developer, but not completed, and they've left an exception for us to go fix. So let's go over to our solution again. And this time we're going to be looking at the index page and fixing some mistakes or creating some features that aren't in the form yet. So we should have in here on the methods that we're calling a not implemented exception. That's what we're seeing in our unit test. So that is our failure message, system not implemented. So first, let's look at the onInitialized async method. So in the onInitialized async method, we're throwing the not implemented exception. And we need to first initialize our data service within the component by awaiting the get regions method. This is going to get us back that known array of strings that we talked about earlier. And then we'll call the selected regions changed method on the model and pass in the default or first value in that collection. That is going to call our selected region changed method. And we will pass in the value from that selected region, and that will populate our regions, our teams rather. It should set the teams for our team dropdown. Now, we'll go ahead and run the unit tests again, and you can probably expect that there will be some more failures in this. So we selected, or we have the region, the first item selected. We haven't quite completed the selected region change yet. So we can see in our message that we have an assertion fail. It's expecting red BB back, and it's getting a null. And that's because we haven't called our get teams by region method yet and let the selected region tell get teams by region what we want to populate that box with. So we'll run that unit test again. That one we expect to pass, and then we still have one more to deal with, and that is when, I'm sorry, I have the wrong test selected there, but selecting a region selects the first value. We need to go ahead and fix that one. Got a little ahead of myself there, but we want to call the data service and then take the first item from it again and populate the drop-down box. We'll go ahead and do that. And now all of our unit tests should pass. So one thing we haven't done in this scenario yet is run the application in the browser. So with all of our unit tests passing, you can probably imagine that we're in a pretty good position. So let's go ahead and run the application and see if it's working. So we'll let the application boot up. And this is part of the process that we've kind of eliminated, is opening this application over and over to check all of our individual components and forms to make sure that it's working right. So you can see our alert box. It is being rendered with a blue background. That's our info background. We can click the dismiss button and it collapses down to show a button to show the message. So we can open it back up. Our birth date is 1980. We also have our drop-down boxes. So if we select our regions, we can select from the regions and it will populate our teams, and then we can select our teams. Now, this running application is using a actual instance of that data service. So you're not seeing the AABBCC input there, but rather some actual regions coming in and being passed to the team dropdown down here. You can see that changes and data binds every time I change it. So all of this is working properly now. And that brings us to the final segment of the talk here. And that is about system testing. So we're talking about evaluating the completed application, the entire integrated system, and do some functionality testing, or we like to call this end-to-end testing. So we're testing this in a much greater way. We're also testing things like, is it working in the browser correctly? And we can do cross-browser testing as well. So for this, I'm going to be using Telerik Test Studio. Now, the reason I'm choosing Telerik Test Studio here is because I'm already using Telerik UI components for my forms. It's already in my system, so I know I have some tight integration points with Test Studio. Another really good reason is because Test Studio is unique in the fact that it has a test recorder that is intuitive and easy to use, where I can just click on items in my browser just as if I was using the application as it's intended to be used. And Test Studio will record those processes, and I can select test points within those clicks and inputs and things that I'm doing in the application. That test integration looks like this. It does work with standard HTML components. You don't have to be using Telerik UI for Blazor to take advantage of this, but you get additional benefits from doing so. So for example, if I were to hover over a Telerik date input, in addition to the HTML validations I might get, it also knows that this is a Telerik date input, and it will apply validations or verifications for specific parts of that component. So in here, we're going to validate or verify that the input is 1980 of a certain date. So let's take a quick look at a demo of Telerik Test Studio in action and see how we can apply this to the application that we already have here. So I'm going to go back into my application or my IDE. We don't need our test runner for this part of the testing, although our results will be shown in the test runner. We do have a special tool just for doing these type of tests. The first thing I want to do is make sure that my application is running. So I'm going to use the open without debugging feature in Visual Studio and make sure that it is running on localhost. So we can go ahead and close that. So our application is running. I'm going to open up my Solution Explorer and navigate to my end-to-end test folder. And in here, I have a new test studio project. We'll go ahead and open it. And you'll notice that I don't have any test steps defined for testing our application yet. So let's go through and test some of the things that we built on that form and ran integration tests for. Now we can test them in a much larger way that includes the browser and maybe some other features of that application as well. So we'll go ahead here and click on record up in the upper left-hand corner, and we will select the local host address that we are running on. So this is going to be 4344. I already have that one stored here in my recent URLs. We'll click record. And now we have an interactive environment where we can create tests for our application. So this is my Test Studio toolbar that's floating here. And from it, I can choose an inspector. This is very similar to the DOM inspection tool that you have with your browser. But when I hover over an element, you'll see that it's detected that a Telerik Blazor date input is here. And under quick steps, I can just verify that the date input is 1980. Now I can fill out my form here. You'll notice it's coming up and telling me that these are Telerik inputs. I can also select my drop-downs. And it is recording all of the steps that I'm doing here. So I can validate that this step is giving me the correct outputs. I can even submit the form and ensure that my thank you window is showing. So I have my Telerik Blazor window, and I can say that the title is thank you and the element is visible. So I can create unit or integration tests for the entire form all the way through submission. So we'll stop recording our test here, and you'll see that it has picked up everything that we did in that browser window. And we can even see icons here of check marks for things that we included as verifications. And now we can run that same test back that we just recorded by clicking the execute test button. So Telerik Test Studio is going to open this, and I'll put my hands up here so you can see that I'm not doing these things manually anymore. It's even typing in the fields. It's verifying our inputs and outputs that we defined through the test tool in an automated way. Telerik Test Studio has intelligence built in, so it can find the elements on the page in a unique way, so you can avoid false negatives and easily identify elements within the DOM. You can also modify those things and modify tests even after they've been created within the editor that you see here. So it's a much deeper subject than we have time to go into, but it's nice to see that we can do all of these different tests within the Blazor environment using one IDE and using several testing tools that are available within the Blazor ecosystem. So we have XUnit and BUnit for doing front end and light integration tests. If you're using the Telerik UI for Blazor, you get even tighter integration with things like JustMock and Test Studio, which they can be used with any type of application in HTML and the .NET ecosystem. But when you have them all together with Telerik UI for Blazor, then you have this really nice testable system. So check out telerik.com for all of those tools as well. So again, just to recap, we can test everything in our applications when we're writing .NET and Blazor apps, and this makes your application much more reliable, and you can focus on getting the problem solved and not worrying about things breaking in the future when you have these tests that you can automatically run as part of your normal routine in publishing your application. I'm Ed Charbeneau. Thanks again for joining me, and we'll have questions and answers after the session.
Hey, it's Joe Eames with ng-conf. If you like that video, be sure to click subscribe either here or here, somewhere over here. And if you're looking for something more, here's another video for you to watch here or there or somewhere.